the superstore stalker and the highway phantom. There's something about the hours between midnight and dawn that strips the world of its safety net. The fluorescent hum of an empty store, the loneliness of an open highway, the silence that isn't quite silence, because silence at 3 a.m. always seems to be hiding something. These are not fiction. These are not campfire stories. These are real accounts from real Americans who showed up to work on the night shift and came face to face with something they will never forget. Some of them barely made it out. This is their story. The Man in Eisel. 9. My name is Derek. I was 22 years old when this happened, though most people said I looked closer to 17. I was working the overnight shift at a large 24-hour retail superstore in central Ohio, one of those enormous warehouse-style places where the aisles feel like city blocks, and the back storage room is basically its own building. On a typical overnight, the customer count hovered under 10 for the entire 8-hour shift. But just because customers were scarce didn't mean I got to kick back. Management kept me busy restocking shelves. Cereal, canned goods, paper products, whatever needed filling. Most nights there might be one other employee somewhere in the building, a stalker, a cleaning crew member, but we rarely crossed paths. That particular Tuesday, I was completely alone. The store was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system breathing overhead. I was deep in the cereal aisle, breaking down cardboard boxes and sliding new product onto the shelves, when I heard something fall in the neighboring aisle. My head snapped up. That's the thing about working nights in a big box store. You always know when someone enters. The automatic sliding doors at the entrance make a sound like a small thunderclap in the dead quiet. There's no way to miss it. I had not heard those doors open. I stood completely still, listening. Then I slowly looked to my left toward the end cap of the aisle. A man was standing there. He was just standing, staring directly at me with an expression I can only describe as completely flat. No smile, no confusion, no acknowledgement that it was strange to be staring at a stock clerk like he was studying a specimen behind glass. His face was unusual in a way that's hard to explain. Not frightening in the conventional sense. More like something was slightly off about the proportions. His upper lip protruded in a way that made his features seem assembled rather than natural. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He blinked slowly. "No. Actually, could you just tell me where the eggs are?" I pointed him in the right direction without much further conversation. He nodded and walked away. That should have been the end of it. I finished up the cereal aisle and began wheeling my flatbed cart toward the back storage room. I was maybe halfway down the main corridor when the same man stepped out from a side aisle and planted himself directly in my path. I stopped the cart. He smiled for the first time. It didn't help. He started talking. Small talk, he called it. He asked my name. He asked how old I was. He asked whether I was in school and where. He asked why I was working nights instead of days. With each question, the knot in my stomach tightened. Then the question shifted. Did I go to parties a lot? Did I have a girlfriend? And then, while placing his hand on my shoulder, he asked if I'd ever had a boyfriend. I stepped back. "I need to finish my route," I said, and started pushing the cart again. He followed. I walked faster. He kept pace. I broke into something between a power walk and a jog, the cart rattling down the linoleum, and finally I pushed through the double doors into the back storage room. He did not follow me in. I stood there for a moment with my back against a metal shelving unit, heart pounding. After about a minute, I decided my best move was to station myself at the register up front. That way, He'd have to come through to check out and I could keep eyes on him until he left. I waited at the register for 25 minutes. He never appeared. Eventually, I concluded he'd either left or stolen whatever he came for. Either way, there was nothing more I could do. Nature called, so I jogged to the employee bathroom at the rear of the store, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. I was on the toilet less than 90 seconds before I heard the bathroom door open. My blood ran cold. I didn't say a word. Every instinct in my body told me to stay silent, stay invisible. I lifted my feet off the floor and balanced them on the stall partition so my shoes wouldn't be visible beneath the door gap. The bathroom went completely silent except for the soft sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing coming from somewhere just outside my stall. Seconds passed that felt like minutes. I sat completely frozen, staring at the grout between the floor tiles, not daring to move a single muscle. Then I looked up. Through the narrow crack along the edge of the stall door, I could see an eye, staring directly at me. I let out a scream that I'm not ashamed of. I grabbed the box cutter I always kept clipped to my belt for opening stock shipments and began dragging the blade slowly, deliberately through the crack of the door, just enough to force him backward. The second I felt the resistance ease, I slammed the stall door open with everything I had. I didn't look back. I didn't check if he fell. I sprinted out of the bathroom, down the main corridor, and straight through the front sliding doors out into the parking lot. The Ohio night air hit me like ice water. I called my supervisor 5 times before he answered. He told me to call the police. I did. By the time the officers arrived, the man was long gone. I checked that parking lot twice before going back inside, and I searched every aisle they'd let me search. Nothing. I only worked the overnight shift 2 more times after that, and I never once left the front of the store. The man by the gas pump. This one belongs to a guy named Marcus. He told me this story himself a few years back, over coffee. He worked the graveyard shift at a highway gas station in rural Tennessee, the kind of place where the road outside sees maybe a handful of cars per hour after midnight, and a single set of headlights in the lot is an event. The hours were 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. 6 hours alone in a bulletproof glass booth in the middle of nowhere. Marcus had just finished a 2-year business degree and was drowning in student loan payments. The only thing that made the job tolerable was the bonus his manager threw in, an extra $5 an hour for anyone willing to do overnight. That extra $40 a shift added up enough to keep him coming back. On a cold night in early December, Marcus was doing what he always did, flipping through an old sports magazine, half watching his phone, when headlights swept across the ceiling of the booth. A dark red pickup truck rolled slowly off the highway and pulled into the lot. The driver got out. Big guy, well over 6 feet, heavy frame. He moved around to the gas pump side and stopped. Marcus barely glanced up from his magazine. He assumed the guy was fumbling with the payment terminal. But when he looked up a full 2 minutes later, the man hadn't moved. He was standing in the exact same position, facing the pump, completely still. Is he confused? Does he need help? Marcus was about to knock on his window and ask when the man slowly turned his head. Not his body, just his head. He turned it toward the booth, toward Marcus, and stared. His face was in partial shadow, the overhead pump lights not quite reaching it. And all Marcus could make out was darkness where the man's features should have been. Marcus went back to his magazine. He was not really reading anymore. Just pay with a card and go. Just pay with a card and go. He looked up again about a minute later. The man had moved closer to the front door of the booth. Not dramatically, maybe 20 feet, but enough to notice. and he was still completely motionless, still staring in Marcus's direction, still showing nothing but shadow where his face should have been. Marcus stood up, moved to the door, and looked more carefully through the reinforced glass. Still nothing visible in that face, just darkness. He twisted the deadbolt, flipped the sign from open to closed, returned to the counter and crouched down behind it so the man outside could no longer see him. He pulled out his phone and started texting everyone he knew who might conceivably be awake at 1:30 in the morning. His roommate, his cousin, an old college friend in a different time zone. He was desperate, not necessarily for help, but to feel like someone else knew this was happening. After about 5 minutes, he slowly rose up and looked through the window again. The man was at the door. Right at the door, face pressed toward the glass, still showing Marcus nothing but an absence of features, a smear of black where a human being's face was supposed to be. Marcus grabbed the desk phone and called 911. The dispatcher's voice was skeptical. "So he's just standing there? He's been staring at me for 20 minutes and I can't see his face and he keeps getting closer," Marcus said, and he wasn't ashamed of how his voice was shaking. The dispatcher said she'd send a car when one was available. Marcus crouched back behind the counter, knees pulled to his chest. Then the sound started. Not knocking. Not the polite tap of knuckles on glass. Thuds. Heavy, rhythmic impacts against the door. The sound of someone trying to break through rather than be let in. The booth shook faintly with each impact. Marcus pressed himself flat against the back wall. Then it stopped. A long silence. Then the sound of an engine starting, headlights crossing the ceiling of the booth, and the crunch of tires pulling back onto the highway. Marcus stayed on the floor for another 2 full minutes. The patrol car showed up about 10 minutes after that, along with a state trooper who'd been nearby. Marcus told them about the red truck, described the direction it had headed. He couldn't describe the driver's face. There was nothing to describe. The officers were polite but honest. Without a plate number or a clear description, there wasn't much they could do. The man hadn't technically committed any crime that could be proven. Marcus left that job 4 months later for a position in Nashville. He still doesn't like working anywhere with windows after dark. The caller and the basement. There are certain things that terrify us in the moment. A strange noise, a face in the window, a shadow that moves wrong. And then the fear fades, the way a nightmare dissolves in morning light, until you're almost convinced you imagined it. And then you find the evidence. This is a story about a man named Owen. Owen worked nights at a small convenience store on a state route in upstate New York, one of those roads that cuts through farmland and connects 2 towns that neither of them are large enough to notice each other. Busy enough to keep the lights on, quiet enough that Owen knew every regular customer by face. The overnight shift ran from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. On busy nights, Owen might see 20 customers, on slow ones, 10. It wasn't glamorous work, but he'd graduated 18 months prior with a communications degree, and the job market wasn't what anyone had promised it would be. Story 3. The Man Who Stayed on a Wednesday Night in Late October. Owen was about 2 hours into his shift when a customer came in that he didn't recognize. The man was in his mid-20s, roughly Owen's own age, but something about him was immediately deeply wrong. He came in making noise, loud, unintelligible vocalizations, somewhere between a moan and a shout, bursting out of him at irregular intervals like a sound effect with a broken trigger. He walked with his head facing forward, but his eyes tilted almost completely upward, showing whites, staring at the ceiling as though he were reading something written there that no one else could see. Owen's instinct was empathy first. His younger brother had a developmental disability. He knew that behavior didn't always map to intention, and that unusual presentation didn't mean threat. He watched the man carefully, spoke to him calmly, tried to understand what he needed. But the man didn't respond to language. He just kept making the sounds, kept staring at the ceiling, kept standing at Owen's counter with nothing in his hands and no apparent purpose. Owen scanned the parking lot through the window. No car, no caretaker, no one waiting outside. The man had apparently walked. After about 15 minutes, Owen gently placed a bag of chips on the counter and told the man he could have them, that it was okay to go ahead and head out. He'd looked up the number for a local social services non-emergency line. He was about to dial when the man turned around and walked out the door. Owen watched him go with a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. About an hour later, the phone on the counter rang. He picked it up. The sounds that came through the receiver were the same sounds, the same vocalizations, the same irregular, broken rhythms he'd heard for 15 minutes at his counter. Owen's blood went cold. He hung up and stood completely still for a few seconds, trying to convince himself it was a coincidence, a wrong number, a prank from a friend who'd happened to be in the store. He spent the remainder of his shift checking the windows, watching the parking lot, studying every shadow that moved at the edge of the lot's light coverage. At 4 a.m., his replacement arrived, and Owen drove home with more relief than he'd felt in years. He threw his bag and his keys on the kitchen table, kicked off his shoes, and was almost to his bedroom when his personal cell phone rang. It was 4:14 a.m. He answered it. The sounds came again. Owen sat down heavily on the edge of his couch. The sounds went on for almost 30 seconds before he managed to disconnect. His hand was shaking. He checked the number. Unknown, no ID. He blocked it. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. The house felt wrong in the dark. He had the persistent, irrational certainty that something was listening to him breathe from just outside his bedroom door. Every time the house settled, he snapped awake. When the tree outside his bedroom window shifted in the wind, he lay rigid for 3 full minutes. By the time pale November light crept through the blinds, he had slept for perhaps 90 minutes. Weeks passed. The memory faded. The blocked number never tried again. Owen went back to his regular rhythms, work, home, weekends, and eventually the whole episode began to feel like an overstressed imagination playing tricks. Then, on a Saturday afternoon about 6 weeks later, he went into the basement for the first time in a while. His basement was unfinished, exposed joists overhead, bare concrete floor, a pull-string bulb that took a second to flicker on. He was looking for a box of winter gear stored near the far wall. He noticed the papers first. Owen wasn't a messy person. The basement was organized. There was no reason for papers to be scattered across the floor. Old mail and pages that looked like they'd been pulled from a desk upstairs. He crouched down and looked at them without touching them, the way you instinctively avoid touching something you don't understand. Then he opened the storage closet in the corner of the basement. On the inside wall of the closet, written in thick black marker, was the name of the convenience store where Owen worked. Below it was the store's street address. Below that was Owen's home address. And arranged on the floor of the closet, lined up with a neatness that was somehow worse than chaos, were 7 kitchen knives pulled from Owen's own kitchen drawers, and a large, fixed-blade pocket knife that Owen had never owned. Owen did not move for a very long time. When he finally did move, it was to call the police. They came, took photographs, took the knives, and filed a report. The closet, they confirmed, showed signs of recent occupation. A worn spot on the concrete consistent with someone sleeping on the floor, a corner that had been used as a toilet. There was no way to know how long he had been there, or exactly when he had left. The basement door, they noted, had a simple lock that could be defeated with a credit card. He had been in the house, possibly for weeks. Owen moved out within a month. He never saw the man again. He sleeps with a deadbolt on his bedroom door to this day, not because anyone is coming back, but because the alternative is not sleeping at all. 7 body bags in the crops. Some horrors announced themselves: the strange customer, the faceless man at the window, the phone call at 4 a.m. These things give you time, not much, but some, to recognize the threat and make a choice. And then there are the horrors that offer no announcement at all. The officer who tells this story asked to remain anonymous. He gave me permission to use the word officer and nothing else. He has never publicly told this story in full. What you're about to read is the first time it's been committed to writing. The white van in the cornfield. He'd been on the force for less than 6 months when it happened. He was working a rural patrol route in central Illinois. Long stretches of 2-lane road, flanked on both sides by full-height August corn. The kind that closes over the road ahead like a tunnel when you drive through it at night with your headlights on. He worked with his K9 partner, a German shepherd named Arlo, who was 2 years old and still running the same learning curve his handler was. It was near 2 a.m. when he spotted the van. White panel van, older model, parked just inside the tree line, where a dirt access road cut between 2 crop fields. Both side doors were wide open. No lights, no movement. He killed his headlights and slowed to a stop on the shoulder. He radioed in the location, described the scene. No plates visible from his angle. He scanned the area. Nothing moving in the dark fields around the van. No figures standing near it. He got out with Arlo on leash and approached carefully. He cleared the visible interior of the van through the open doors. Empty front cab. Nothing visible in the center compartment. Then he moved to the rear. Arlo lost his mind. The shepherd lunged forward so hard, the leash burned through the officer's palm before he caught it. The dog was not growling in the low, controlled way of a trained working animal. He was pulling and scrambling like something had plugged into his most primitive instinct. The officer steadied himself, gripped the latch on the rear doors, and pulled them open. The smell hit him first. It was biological, heavy and thick and wrong in a way that bypassed the rational mind entirely. His eyes confirmed what his nose had already told him before he'd fully processed it. There were 7 body bags, lined up in the cargo area of the van, each one full. Each one showing a pair of feet extending from the unzipped bottom end, the soles of boots and sneakers pointing upward. He radioed for immediate backup, his voice completely controlled, his training holding where his emotions were not. He kept Arlo close and backed away from the van, one hand on his weapon, scanning the wall of corn in every direction. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Arlo broke free. The shepherd tore into the corn at full sprint, and the officer followed the sound of his barking, crashing through the stalks at a full run, leaves and husks slapping at his face, the ground uneven under his feet in the dark. The beam of his flashlight jumped and swayed. And then Arlo's barking stopped. The officer stopped. The corn rustled in every direction. Not wind. Not one source. Multiple sources. Moving around him. Closing in. The sounds of people who did not want to be seen. Navigating the rows with practiced efficiency. He was surrounded. He stood still. His light swept left, then right, then behind him. The rustling stopped. The field was silent. The only sound was his own breathing. Then 2 arms wrapped around his throat from behind. The grip was practiced, forearm across the larynx leveraged from behind. His flashlight dropped. His vision began to gray at the edges. His hands went to the forearm on his throat, but the angle was wrong and the grip was solid, and he could not break it, and he understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that he was going to die in this field. Then Arlo's bark cut through the corn like a flare. The arms released as the man screamed. Arlo had found him. In that fraction of a second, with his attacker occupied by 80 pounds of German Shepherd, the officer turned. He pulled his weapon. He fired once. He doesn't elaborate on what happened after the trigger pull. He has never, in retelling this story, described that part in any detail. And I haven't pressed him. What he does say is that he grabbed Arlo's leash and ran, back through the corn, back toward the road, back toward his cruiser. He could hear movement behind him the entire way. Not one person. Several. He made it to the car. He drove a quarter-mile down the road before stopping. He sat in the dark with Arlo panting in the back seat and his hands shaking on the wheel. Backup arrived within 8 minutes. The van was gone. The officer had not managed to capture the plate number on his dash cam. He had not written it down. In 6 months, he had not yet developed the automatic habit of logging plates on unattended vehicles, and the shock of what he found in the cargo compartment had overridden the training he did have. The body bags were gone with the van. There was no evidence in the corn rows beyond broken stalks, no blood trail that could be confirmed, no physical evidence left by anyone who might have been present. His report was filed. An investigation was opened. Leads were pursued. None of them led anywhere. He still works in law enforcement. He still thinks about the 7 pairs of feet. He told me that the question that keeps him up at night isn't who those people were, or where the van went, or even whether the men in the cornfield were ever caught. The question is simpler than that. Why did they let him go? They had him. The men in that field had him surrounded. The one behind him almost finished it. They had every advantage: terrain, numbers, darkness. And yet when he ran, no one followed him to the road. He's never found an answer that fully satisfies him. And, honestly, neither have I. What the night shift really costs 4 stories. 4 Americans who showed up to do an honest night's work and came home changed. Derek, who sprinted out of a 24-hour superstore in Ohio with a box cutter in his hand, never felt fully safe behind a register again. Marcus, who crouched on the floor of a Tennessee highway booth and listened to something try to break through the door. Owen, who found a stranger's bed in his own basement and the stranger's knives arranged in his closet beside them. And a young officer in Illinois who fired his weapon in a cornfield, ran to his car with his dog, and watched the evidence disappear. These are not extraordinary people. They are not thrill seekers or ghost hunters. They are ordinary Americans who took night shift jobs because the bills didn't pause for daylight hours, and they encountered something that no job description prepared them for. What makes the night shift different? There is a reason horror movies are almost always set at night. It's not just atmosphere, it's neurological. Human beings are diurnal creatures. Our visual systems are optimized for daylight. Our threat detection mechanisms, which evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, are calibrated on the assumption that the people around us can be clearly seen and clearly evaluated. The night strips that away. In low light, the face becomes harder to read. Micro-expressions disappear. The distance between confused stranger and deliberate threat compresses. And the isolation of the overnight shift, the empty store, the abandoned highway, the patrol route with no backup for 12 minutes, removes the social scaffolding that normally keeps predatory behavior in check. Every person in these stories encountered something that normal working conditions would have prevented. Derek's store was designed to have multiple employees present on the floor. That night, cost-cutting left him alone. Marcus's booth was supposed to have a security check every 2 hours. The one scheduled for 1 a.m. arrived 4 hours late. Owen's workplace had no camera in the parking lot and no system for flagging repeated unusual incidents. The young officer was 6 months out of training and had never worked a rural route with a K-9 partner before. The night shift exploits the gaps. The psychology of the predator. 2 of the 4 individuals in these stories, the man in Derek's store and the man in Owen's basement, demonstrate a pattern that behavioral psychologists call approach escalation. An initial benign contact followed by incremental boundary violations, each one slightly larger than the last, designed to test response. The man in Derek's store didn't begin by following him into a bathroom. He began by asking for directions to the eggs, then small talk, then personal questions, then physical contact. Each step tested whether Derek would push back, and each step prepared the next. The man in Owen's basement, if the timeline can be reconstructed, began with a public interaction, then a phone call to the store, then a call to Owen's personal number. At some point in that sequence, he gained access to Owen's home and conducted surveillance of Owen's habits over what may have been weeks. The knives in the closet were not placed there in anger. They were arranged, deliberately. The arrangement suggests someone who had a plan and abandoned it. What changed his mind? Neither Owen nor the investigators who looked at his case ever determined that. What's disturbing about approach escalation is how ordinary each individual step feels. Derek noted at the time that he was uncomfortable, but not immediately alarmed. The questions were intrusive, not threatening. By the time alarm was appropriate, the man was already in the bathroom. Recognizing approach escalation requires trusting the cumulative picture rather than any single data point. If someone's behavior keeps crossing lines, the pattern matters more than whether anyone crossing seems serious enough to act on. What they did right. Derek used a tool he had on him, the box cutter, as a deterrent, not a weapon. He created a distraction and broke out of a confined space rather than waiting for the threat to define the outcome. He got outside immediately. Marcus locked his door and called law enforcement while the threat was still active, rather than waiting to see how things developed. He stayed out of the attacker's line of sight during the confrontation at the door. Owen's case is harder because by the time he understood the full situation, the immediate threat had already resolved itself. What he did right was document everything, involve law enforcement, and remove himself from the compromised location, and not dismiss what he'd found as something explicable. The officer in Illinois made a split-second decision under conditions of near-zero visibility, with his oxygen cut off, against multiple unknown actors in a dark field. He got his dog and got out. He's questioned that decision for years, but in survival terms, it was correct. Getting out alive is always correct. The thing about 3 a.m. There's a reason the phrase 3 a.m. carries weight in American culture. In the quiet dark of the overnight hours, the normal rules feel suspended. The stores that should be full are empty. The roads that should be busy are dead. The protocols and procedures and social contracts that govern human interaction in daylight don't quite extend past midnight. The people in these stories know that now. Derek keeps a personal alarm in his pocket when he works any job that involves being alone in a building after dark. Marcus doesn't take any position that requires him to be alone behind glass at night. Owen's new apartment has a reinforced door on the basement stair. The officer carries a secondary weapon and calls in plate numbers before he steps out of the car. Every single time. No exceptions. None of them are paralyzed by what happened. They are all, by their own accounts, functional and employed and living their lives. But something calcified in each of them during those nights, a specific permanent awareness that the world contains people whose intentions do not announce themselves, and that the hour between 2 and 4 a.m. is when those intentions are most likely to surface. The stories that never get told. For every story in this video, there are 100 that never got recorded. Night shift workers, in retail, at gas stations, in warehouses, in hospitals, on patrol. Encounter situations they don't report because they don't think they'll be believed, or because nothing technically illegal happened, or because they're afraid of losing the job they need to pay their bills. Derek's store manager told him to call the police and went back to sleep. He never asked Derek how he was doing. He never asked whether Derek felt safe returning to work. The next scheduled overnight shift, Derek's name was on the roster without discussion. Marcus told his district manager what happened, in writing, and received an email 3 days later with a link to the company's wellness hotline. Owen's experience was investigated and then quietly filed. He was never offered relocation assistance, counseling referrals, or any formal acknowledgement that his employer's location had been used to surveil him. The young officer was told informally by a senior colleague that the experience he'd had was part of the job. He was given 3 days off and then returned to the same patrol route. This is how we treat people who work in the dark on our behalf. One final thought. The night shift exists because the world doesn't stop running at sunset. The stores need restocking. The gas stations need staffing. The roads need patrolling. The hospitals need covering. Someone has to be awake while everyone else sleeps. And in America, that someone is usually the person who can't afford not to be. Most nights, nothing happens. But the night shift strips away every layer of protection that daylight provides. The crowds, the cameras, the colleagues, the casual social surveillance of a world that's paying attention. What remains is just a person, alone in a building or on a road, trying to get through to 6 a.m., and whatever else happens to be awake out there with them. Lock your doors tonight. Tip your night shift workers, and if you ever find something in your basement that shouldn't be there, don't wait until morning to call. Deeper into the dark. 3 more accounts. The 4 stories above represent a fraction of what comes in when you ask the question publicly. The question is simple. Did something happen to you on the night shift? The answers are not simple. They arrive in long paragraphs at midnight. They arrive as voice memos sent by people who say they've never told this to anyone. They arrive from security guards and overnight nurses and warehouse pickers and long-haul dispatchers who work the board from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. in a building with 4 people in it. Here are 3 more. The woman who wouldn't leave this account comes from a woman named Priya. She worked the overnight desk at a budget extended stay motel outside of Indianapolis, the kind of place where guests rented by the week, not the night, and where the parking lot always had a few cars that seemed to belong to people who weren't technically staying there. At 1:30 on a Tuesday morning, a woman came in through the lobby door. She was dressed normally, jeans, a hoodie, sneakers. She didn't approach the desk. She sat down in one of the lobby chairs near the door and looked at her phone. Priya asked if she could help her. The woman said she was waiting for her ride. Priya went back to work. 15 minutes later, the woman was still there. Priya asked again, had her ride arrived? The woman smiled and said almost, just a few more minutes. At 2:15 a.m., 45 minutes after she'd arrived, the woman was still in the lobby chair. She had not moved to use the restroom, had not accepted the offer of water, had not checked her phone in the last 20 minutes. She was just sitting, facing the front door, completely still. Priya called the overnight manager, who told her to give it another half hour. At 2:45, Priya noticed something she hadn't registered before. The woman in the lobby chair was not looking at the front door anymore. She was looking at the door to the stairwell that led to the guest floors. And she was watching it the same way you watch something you're waiting to see come through. Priya called the manager back. The manager came down and asked the woman to leave. She did, calmly, without argument, with a small smile that neither of them could quite interpret. They reviewed the parking lot camera afterward. There had been no car, no rideshare pickup, no person meeting her outside. She had simply walked away into the dark. The following morning, a guest on the 3rd floor reported to housekeeping that his room door had been found unlocked when he woke up. He was certain he'd locked it before bed. Nothing had been taken. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. But the window above his bed had been opened from the inside. The recording. This comes from a man named Terrell, who worked overnight security at a corporate office park in suburban Atlanta. 4 buildings, 200,000 square feet of empty office space, and Terrell doing a solo patrol loop every 90 minutes from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. On the 3rd building of his 3 a.m. loop, he picked up something on his radio scanner. Not a voice, but a sound. A rhythmic, mechanical clicking, looping every 40 seconds or so, broadcast on an internal building frequency that was supposed to be used only by maintenance. He reported it to the monitoring station. The tech on duty said it wasn't coming from any of the building's systems. Terrell tracked the signal to the 4th floor of Building 3, a floor that had been vacant for 8 months since its last tenant moved out. The power was off on that floor. His flashlight lit the empty office shells in long, narrow cones as he moved through them. He found the source in a corner office near the north stairwell. A small digital recorder, the kind journalists use, placed deliberately in the center of an empty desk. It had been there long enough to accumulate a thin coat of dust on its casing, but the record light was red and active. He hit stop. He rewound. He pressed play. There were voices, dozens of them layered on top of each other, recorded over apparently weeks or months. Some were snippets of phone calls. Some were conversations between what sounded like Terrell himself and the monitoring station, time-stamped from his previous patrol rounds. Someone had been sitting in this empty office in the dark, recording everything that moved through the building, for what the file metadata later suggested was at least 11 weeks. There were also sounds that Terrell could not identify. Long, irregular intervals of low sound that the tech who later analyzed the file described as consistent with a human voice at the edge of audibility, speaking too softly to be transcribed. The recorder had no fingerprints on it. The room had no sign of forced entry. The building had exactly one exterior door that served the vacant 4th floor, and the magnetic access log showed it had not been opened in 8 months. No one ever determined how the recorder had gotten there. Terrell left security work 6 months later. He now works in data analysis from home during daylight hours with the blinds open. The last call. This one comes from an EMT named Brittany. It happened 3 years ago and she's never reported it officially, though she's told me she doesn't believe official reporting would have changed anything. She was on a quiet overnight shift, a Tuesday in February, rural Pennsylvania. The kind of night when calls come in maybe once every 2 hours if the roads are bad. She was parked at a rest stop off Route 6 with her partner, Aaron, both of them half asleep in the rig when the dispatch radio activated. The call came in as a welfare check at a rural address about 4 miles north. Someone had reported a light flickering irregularly in a farmhouse that was supposed to be vacant. No reported emergency. Standard protocol was for law enforcement to take the lead on vacant property calls, but the nearest unit was 17 minutes out, and dispatch had sent the ambulance as a precautionary secondary. Brittany and Aaron arrived first. The farmhouse sat back from the road down a gravel lane surrounded by bare winter trees. The light in the upstairs window was doing exactly what the caller had described, flickering in short, irregular bursts like a phone screen being repeatedly turned on and off. Aaron stayed with the rig and radioed their position. Brittany approached the house. The front door was unlocked. She pushed it open and called into the dark. No response. She swept her flashlight through the ground floor. Empty kitchen, empty sitting room, bare floors, no furniture. The house had clearly been uninhabited for some time. She found the staircase and called up again before ascending. At the top of the stairs, the light was coming from a room at the end of the hall. She pushed the door open. The room was empty. There was no lamp, no phone, no device of any kind. The only window faced the road, the one the original caller had reported seeing from outside. There was a candle on the windowsill. It was lit. It had been burning recently enough that the wax around the wick was still liquid. Someone had been here within the last 20 minutes. She turned to leave and found Aaron standing in the doorway behind her. He had come up without radioing. He looked pale. He said very quietly that she needed to come back to the rig right now. On the rig's side panel, facing the road, someone had written 3 words in the mud that had accumulated on the white paint. They had been written while Aaron was inside the vehicle, facing forward, without him hearing or noticing anyone approach. The words were, "We saw you." The state police unit arrived 8 minutes later. They swept the property and found nothing. The candle in the upstairs window had burned down to a nub by the time they reached it. The writing on the rig washed off in the rain on the drive back to the station. Brittany has requested Inside City assignment every year since then. She's received it twice out of 3 requests. She still checks the side panel of every rig before she gets in. The science of fear, the cost of night, and the ones we don't talk about. Every story in this video has one thing in common. The people who lived through them were alone when it happened. Not emotionally alone. Not metaphorically alone. Physically, practically, structurally alone. Placed in a position by their employer, their economic circumstances, or both, where there was no one else present to witness, to help, or to intervene. That isolation is not accidental. It's a feature. The economics of the night shift. The night shift exists because businesses need continuous operation and humans need sleep. And those 2 facts are irreconcilable. Somebody has to staff the lights-on hours, and staffing those hours costs more because people reasonably don't want to work them. A $5 hourly premium on the night shift sounds generous until you factor in what that premium is actually compensating for. Studies on shift work consistently show elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and cardiovascular disease among overnight workers. Chronic circadian disruption, the technical term for what happens when you regularly sleep during the day and work through the night, is now classified by the World Health Organization as a probable occupational carcinogen. People who work nights for extended periods have measurably higher rates of gastrointestinal disorders, immune suppression, and metabolic syndrome. That's what the $5 an hour is covering. Not the inconvenience, the genuine biological cost. And that's before anything unusual happens. The workers in this video, Derek, Marcus, Owen, the unnamed officer, Priya, Terrell, Brittany, all had something in common beyond the night shift itself. They were all, at the time of their encounters, in positions of economic vulnerability. They were paying off student loans, or covering living costs after graduation, or taking the only job available in a rural area, or accepting a shift premium because the base pay wasn't enough on its own. Economic vulnerability and overnight isolation are the conditions under which predators operate. They are not random occurrences. They concentrate reliably in specific places at specific hours, and the people most exposed to those conditions are the ones least able to opt out of them. What behavioral science tells us? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has documented patterns in predatory behavior that recur across many of the scenarios described in this video. The most relevant pattern is what they call environmental exploitation, the targeting of locations and circumstances that reduce victim resistance and witness probability simultaneously. Empty stores in the early morning hours, isolated highway outposts, vacant corporate buildings on overnight security routes, rural farmhouses visible from a state route at 3 a.m. Each of these environments has something in common. They contain a single individual whose presence is known, predictable, and whose opportunity to seek help is constrained by both geography and protocol. Derek couldn't leave the store mid-shift. Marcus couldn't leave the booth. Owen couldn't simply not answer the store phone. The patrol officer couldn't drive away from a suspicious vehicle without at least investigating. The night shift doesn't just create isolation. It creates predictable isolation. It tells anyone paying attention, there will be exactly one person here, at these coordinates, from these hours to these hours, every night that the schedule says. Awareness of this pattern is itself protective, not because awareness prevents bad actors from identifying targets. It doesn't. But because it changes the behavior of the person in the environment. Derek's box cutter, Marcus's locked door, the patrol officer's radio call before exiting the vehicle. In each case, the protective action taken was a small one. But small actions taken early, in the right sequence, change outcomes. The ones we don't talk about. For every story that makes it into a video like this, there are dozens that don't. The night shift nurse who found a patient in the hallway of a locked ward who had no record of admission and no explanation for how he'd gotten in, and who was told by her supervisor to document it as a paperwork error. The warehouse picker in New Jersey who discovered while doing a 4 a.m. inventory sweep of a back section of the facility that one of the large shipping containers had been locked from the inside. The overnight cleaning crew member in a Phoenix high-rise who entered a vacant executive suite on the 32nd floor to find that the dry erase board had been written on recently. The coffee machine was still warm, and the chair behind the desk was still spinning slowly when he walked in, despite the floor having been vacant for 4 months. These stories don't make it into videos because the people who experience them are afraid of professional consequences. Because nothing was ultimately proven. Because what happened is too strange to explain without sounding unhinged. And in a country where the night shift worker is already invisible, adding unhinged to the descriptor feels like a risk they can't take. But these experiences are real. They are widely distributed across industries and geographies, and they share a common architecture. Normal person alone in the dark, encountering something that the protocols they'd been given were never designed to address. The hidden community. What's worth knowing, and what doesn't get discussed nearly enough, is that night shift workers have developed an informal network of mutual recognition. If you've worked the overnight, you know other people who have worked the overnight. And in those conversations, late at night or early in the morning over coffee, the stories come out, not to alarm each other, not to entertain, but because the experience of encountering something genuinely threatening while alone and responsible for a building or a post or a route is isolating in a way that only another overnight worker can fully understand. Derek told me he has 3 friends from his overnight retail days, and all 3 of them have a story. Marcus said the same thing about the highway gas station circuit. Everyone who stayed for more than a few months had something. The officer who found the van in the cornfield told me that when he finally, after 4 years, mentioned the incident to a senior colleague, the response was immediate and specific. That road. And then the senior officer told him something that had happened to him on the same stretch of highway 6 years earlier that he had never filed a report on. The night shift creates a community bound by things that can't be said in daylight. Before you close this, if you're watching this on a lunch break or late at night in bed or on a commute home, take a second and think about the person who was awake when you were sleeping last night. The gas station attendant, the ER triage nurse, the retail stalker, the overnight security guard in the office park down the road, the long-haul trucker, the dispatch operator, the EMT on overnight rotation in a rural county. They are not doing it for the adventure. Most of them are doing it because the arithmetic of their life requires it, and every single one of them is doing it in conditions that the rest of us have the luxury of never thinking about. The night is not inherently dangerous. Most nights, most overnight workers go in, do their shift, and come home without incident. The statistical probability that any individual night shift worker will encounter what Derek or Marcus or Owen or the others encountered is relatively low, but it is not zero. And the people who face that non-zero probability do so, more often than not, alone. So the next time you pull into a gas station at 2 a.m. for a bottle of water, look at the person behind the counter. Make eye contact. Say thank you like you mean it. They are keeping a light on for you, in the dark. 3 final accounts when protocols fail. The inventory count. This one comes from a man named Jason. He worked overnight inventory at a large electronics distribution warehouse outside of Louisville, Kentucky. The facility covered roughly 300,000 square feet and employed a crew of 12 on the overnight shift. But inventory count nights ran with just 4 people, spread across different wings of the building. In effect, you were alone in a football field-sized section of concrete shelving for 4 hours at a time. Jason was in the far eastern wing at 2:30 a.m. when he heard the rolling ladder at the far end of his aisle start to move. The ladders used in the facility were heavy, steel frame weighted base, requiring deliberate effort to push. They didn't drift. They didn't shift from building vibration or air conditioning. When a ladder moved in that building, it was because someone pushed it. Jason called out. Standard practice. Sometimes a crew member from a different section came through without radioing ahead. No answer. He walked the length of the aisle. The ladder had traveled about 20 feet from where he'd last left it. No one was visible. He checked the adjacent aisles. Empty. He radioed the overnight supervisor, who said he'd do a check of the camera system. Jason went back to his count. The supervisor called back 4 minutes later. The camera covering the eastern wing had been offline since 11 p.m. No one had been notified. The maintenance log showed a scheduled maintenance window for that camera. But it had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, not tonight. Jason asked who would have changed the schedule. The supervisor said he didn't know. Jason finished his count in significantly less than his standard time and did not return to the eastern wing alone for the remainder of his employment. The coat. This one comes from a woman named Sandra. She managed a 24-hour laundromat in South Chicago for 3 years, working the overnight shift solo 3 nights a week. The job was, in her words, 95% boring and 5% genuinely frightening. And over 3 years, the 5% accumulated. The incident she chose to share happened in her 2nd year. A man came in at 4 a.m. with a garbage bag full of laundry. This was not unusual. A lot of overnight customers used the laundromat for large loads and preferred the quiet. He was polite. He loaded 2 machines. He sat down to wait. Sandra noticed about 20 minutes in that he hadn't brought a phone, a book, or anything to occupy himself with. He just sat. She noticed 30 minutes in that he was watching the only security camera in the facility. not with curiosity, but with the focused attention of someone trying to determine its range of coverage. She noticed 40 minutes in that his coat, which he draped over the chair beside him when he sat down, was now on the chair behind him, closer to the door, and positioned so that it could be put on quickly while moving. She was not certain any of this meant anything. She is a careful person who is not given to panic. She completed her shift routinely. The man's laundry finished. He folded it, thanked her, and left. Nothing happened. But 3 weeks later, she found out through a neighborhood alert that a solo worker robbery had occurred at a laundromat 12 blocks away at 4 a.m. by a man matching the description she would have given. The coat, she says, is what she still thinks about. The small repositioning of an object. The preparation that looked like nothing until you understood what it was preparation for. She bought a door alarm that same week and has used one at every job she's held since. The question. On the whiteboard, last one. This comes from a man named Christopher who worked the overnight shift at a small psychiatric residential facility in western Massachusetts. Not inpatient, a step-down facility, lower acuity but still requiring overnight staffing. The shift ran 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and Christopher shared it with one other staff member on a rotating basis. At 3 a.m. during his partner's rest break, Christopher did a standard room check, visual confirmation through door windows that residents were present and settled. On the last room, the window was blocked from the inside. A piece of paper had been taped to the window facing out. On the paper, in neat handwriting, was a single question. "Do you know what I have in here?" Christopher called his partner immediately. They did not open the door. They called the on-call supervisor, who called the on-call physician. By the time additional staff arrived, the paper had been removed from the window, and the resident, who had a history of impulsive behavior but no history of violence, was asleep in their bed. The room was checked. Nothing was found. No one ever determined when the paper had been placed, or whether the resident had placed it, or found it somewhere and taped it up, or whether the question was directed at Christopher specifically, or was simply a thought written down for no one in particular. The resident, when asked the next morning, said they didn't remember doing it. Christopher worked that facility for 2 more years without another incident of that kind. But every night on every room check, he now waits a full 3 seconds at each window before moving to the next one. He told me he's not sure what he's waiting for. He's not sure he wants to know. What stays with you? There is a phenomenon that researchers who study post-traumatic stress refer to as hypervigilance consolidation, the way a single threatening experience can permanently recalibrate an individual's baseline threat awareness. The person doesn't become paranoid exactly. They become precise. Derek knows exactly how far a bathroom stool door swings before it catches the hinge. He knows because he's measured it in every public restroom he's entered since Ohio. Not consciously, not obsessively. It's just something his nervous system wants to know now, automatically, before he closes the door. Marcus knows the difference between a person who is standing still because they're confused and a person who is standing still because they are watching. He learned that difference in Tennessee in a gas station booth through reinforced glass at 1:30 a.m. He's never had to apply that knowledge again, but he has it. Owen doesn't leave things in his basement. Not boxes, not storage bins, not seasonal gear. The basement of his current apartment is empty. He goes down there about twice a year, looks around for 30 seconds, and comes back upstairs. He told me it takes about half an hour for the adrenaline to fully clear after. The unnamed officer files every plate number, every single one, every unattended vehicle, every parking lot stop, every routine traffic encounter. It costs him an extra 90 seconds per incident. He has never stopped to calculate how many extra hours that has added up to cross his career. He says he doesn't want to know. Priya asks every lobby visitor to describe their ride before they sit down. It's not policy. Her manager has never told her to do it. She does it because a woman sat in her lobby for over an hour, watching a door, and she wants a few more seconds of information before she decides whether to be worried. Terrell keeps a second flashlight in his car at all times, sealed in its original packaging. He doesn't use it. It's a backup. He told me he doesn't know exactly why having an unopened backup flashlight makes him feel better, but it does, and he stopped questioning it years ago. Brittany checks the side panel of every rig before she gets in. She checks the roof. She checks the area under the vehicle with her flashlight. It takes 45 seconds. Her partner Aaron does the same thing every time without discussion. None of these behaviors are irrational. None of them are symptoms of illness. They are the reasonable, proportionate responses of people who encountered something the world did not prepare them for, and who have decided, quietly, privately, without drama, that they would prefer to be prepared next time. That's what the night shift really costs. Not the sleep disruption, not the circadian strain, not the biological wear documented in the epidemiological studies. It costs a version of innocence that most people never have to spend. The belief that the empty store is just an empty store, that the figure at the gas pump is just a confused customer, that the phone call at 4 a.m. is a wrong number, that the basement is just a basement. Once you've learned that these things sometimes are not what they appear to be, you can't unlearn it. The knowledge doesn't make you afraid. It makes you careful. And careful at 3 a.m. in an empty building on the American night shift is exactly what you need to be. Stay safe out there. And if you work the overnight, you're seen. What you do matters. And more people than you know are grateful for the lights you keep on in the dark.